trapped 1,575 feet underwater with 12 minutes of air left, the Pisces 3 miracle. Imagine being trapped in a metal coffin the size of a small car, 480 meters beneath the Atlantic Ocean, where the crushing pressure outside could turn you into paste in an instant. The temperature inside hovers just above freezing. Your breath creates clouds of vapor that freeze on the steel walls. You have 72 hours of oxygen, 3 days to live or die, and every breath you take brings you closer to suffocation. There's no light except your failing flashlight. No sound except the creaking of metal and your own heartbeat thundering in your ears. This isn't a nightmare. This is exactly what happened to Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman on August 29, 1973, when their submarine, Pisces 3, plummeted to the ocean floor in what would become the deepest underwater rescue ever attempted. Roger Chapman squinted through the tiny porthole of Pisces 3, watching the underwater telephone cable they were supposed to be laying snake away into the murky depths below. It was a routine job, or as routine as any job could be when you're operating a submersible in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 150 miles off the coast of Ireland. At 44 years old, Chapman was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours in submarines. Beside him sat 35-year-old Roger Mallinson, the younger but equally experienced co-pilot. They called themselves the Two Rogers, and they'd worked together so many times they could practically read each other's minds. Bringing her up, Chapman announced into the radio, his British accent crackling through the communication line to the surface ship, the Vickers Voyager. "We've got the cable positioned. Job's done for today." Mallinson checked the gauges one final time. Everything looked normal. Depth, 1,575 feet. Systems, green across the board. The little submarine, barely 16 feet long and weighing 9 tons, began its ascent through the dark water. Both men had done this 100 times before. Up to the surface, a hot shower, dinner, and some well-deserved rest. Then, without warning, everything went catastrophically wrong. A violent jolt shook the entire vessel. The rear sphere, where all the machinery was housed, suddenly flooded with seawater. Chapman's eyes went wide as he saw the depth gauge spinning in the wrong direction. They weren't going up anymore. They were falling. "We're going down," Mallinson shouted, his hands flying across the controls, desperately trying to blow the ballast tanks. Nothing responded. The submarine had lost all power to its buoyancy systems. The ocean swallowed them like a stone dropping through honey. Down, down, down into the abyss. Chapman watched helplessly as the depth gauge climbed past 1,600 feet, 1,700 feet, 1,800 feet. The pressure outside was increasing with every foot they fell. Pressure so immense it could crush a human skull like an eggshell. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, Pisces 3 hit the bottom. The impact wasn't dramatic, more like settling into mud. But the silence that followed was deafening. Chapman and Mallinson looked at each other in the dim emergency lighting, both men's faces pale, both understanding exactly what had just happened. They were sitting on the ocean floor at 1,575 feet below the surface. At this depth, the water pressure was approximately 690 pounds per square inch, nearly 47 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. The steel sphere protecting them was all that stood between them and instant death. And they had just used up the first few minutes of their 72-hour oxygen supply. Mallinson pulled out a notepad with shaking hands and began calculating. As the technical specialist, he knew the numbers by heart, but he needed to see them written down to make them real. "Okay," he said, his voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances. "We've got 2 72-hour scrubber canisters for the carbon dioxide. That's the good news." "And the bad news?" Chapman asked, though he already knew. "The cold. We're sitting in 35-degree water. The hull's going to conduct that temperature straight into our little bubble here. We've got no heat, no power for anything except the emergency lights." Mallinson looked up from his calculations. We'll be hypothermic long before we run out of air if we're not careful. Chapman nodded slowly. Then we conserve everything. We move as little as possible. We breathe slowly. We think warm thoughts. It was a joke, but neither man laughed. Above them, on the surface ship Vickers Voyager, controlled chaos had erupted the moment Pisces 3 went silent. Commander Al Trice, the operations director, had watched the submarine's transponder signal disappear from his screen like a candle being snuffed out. He'd immediately tried the underwater telephone. Pisces 3, this is Voyager, do you copy? Pisces 3, respond please. Nothing but static. Trice felt his stomach drop. He knew exactly what had happened, the same thing that haunted every submarine operator's nightmares. A catastrophic failure at depth. The question wasn't whether Chapman and Mallinson were in trouble. The question was whether they were already dead. He grabbed the radio handset. This is Vickers Voyager declaring a submarine emergency. We have 2 men down at 480 meters. I repeat, 2 men at 480 meters. We need immediate assistance. Even as he made the call, Trice knew the grim reality. In 1973, deep-sea rescue technology was primitive at best. The deepest successful submarine rescue in history had been 1,200 feet, and that had been an American Navy vessel with resources far beyond what was available in the middle of the Atlantic. Pisces 3 was at 1,575 feet, deeper than anyone had ever attempted to rescue a submarine before. The race against time had begun. Inside Pisces 3, the 2 Rogers settled into their new reality. The temperature inside the sphere had already dropped to 50 degrees Fahrenheit and was still falling. They could see their breath-forming clouds of vapor that condensed on the freezing metal walls and dripped back down on them like cold sweat. Chapman checked his watch. They know we're down here. They'll be organizing a rescue right now. Question is, can they get here in time? Mallinson said, pulling his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. Neither man had dressed for a survival situation. Why would they? This was supposed to be a 4-hour job. To conserve oxygen, they made a pact: minimal movement, minimal talking. They would lie still, control their breathing, and ration every molecule of air. The carbon dioxide scrubbers would clean the air, but only if they didn't overwhelm the system by hyperventilating or panicking. The psychological torture began almost immediately. The sphere was so small that both men had to remain in a semi-reclined position. They couldn't stand up. They couldn't stretch. They could barely move without bumping into each other or the massive equipment surrounding them. The walls pressed in from all sides, a constant reminder that they were trapped in a bubble of air surrounded by millions of tons of water. And then there was the darkness. When they turned off the emergency light to conserve battery power, the blackness was absolute. It was the kind of darkness that doesn't exist on land, where there's always some ambient light from stars or moon or distant cities. This was the darkness of the deep ocean, complete and total, a darkness so thick you could feel it pressing against your eyeballs. In that darkness, time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. The cold seeped into their bones, making their joints ache and their teeth chatter. They took turns sleeping, or trying to, while the other kept watch, though there was nothing to watch for except the slow passage of time on their luminous watch faces. "Roger," Chapman said after what might have been 6 hours or might have been 12. "Yeah. If we don't make it, I want you to know you're a damn fine partner. Best I've ever worked with." Mallinson was quiet for a moment. "Same to you, mate. But we're getting out of this. They're not going to leave us down here." It was bravado, but they both needed to hear it. On the surface, Commander Trice was coordinating the most complex rescue operation in maritime history. He'd made calls to every organization that might possibly help, The British Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, the Canadian Navy, commercial diving companies, oceanographic institutes. The response was overwhelming, and overwhelming in its complexity. The closest rescue submersible was Pisces II, the sister ship to the trapped sub. But it was in a completely different location and would take precious hours to transport to the site. Pisces V was farther away but also mobilizing. The U.S. Navy was sending the COV-3, a remotely operated vehicle that might be able to attach a line to the sunken sub. Every option came with massive logistical challenges. How do you get a rescue submarine to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? How do you find a 9-ton submarine on the ocean floor when you're searching an area of hundreds of square miles? How do you attach a lifting line to a submarine in the dark, at crushing pressure, when you can barely see 6 feet in front of you? The clock was ticking. Every hour that passed brought the two Rogers closer to suffocation or hypothermia. "We've got a transponder ping," one of the technicians shouted. Relief flooded through Trice. The emergency transponder was still functioning, which meant the pressure sphere hadn't ruptured. Chapman and Mallinson were alive, for now. But finding them and rescuing them were two different challenges entirely. Pisces II arrived on site first, piloted by a crew that included some of Chapman and Mallinson's closest friends. They dove immediately, descending through the dark water with their lights sweeping the ocean floor. The bottom at this depth was an alien landscape of silt and rock, dotted with strange deep-sea creatures that had never seen sunlight. Pisces II to Voyager, "We've got visual contact with Pisces III." The cheer that went up on the Voyager was short-lived. Seeing the trapped submarine and rescuing it were vastly different problems. Pisces III was sitting upright in the silt, tilted at about 15 degrees. The rear sphere was completely flooded, but the crew sphere, the front compartment where Chapman and Mallinson were trapped, appeared intact. The problem was getting a line attached to it so the surface ship could pull it up. This was where the technology of 1973 showed its limitations. The remote-operated COV-3 tried repeatedly to attach a lifting line, but the strong currents and poor visibility made it nearly impossible. Lines got tangled. Equipment failed. Precious hours slipped away. Inside Pisces III, Chapman and Mallinson were aware of the rescue attempts through the underwater telephone, which had started working again. They could hear the crew of Pisces II talking, could hear the whir of CURV-3's propellers. But they could also feel time running out. "How's our air supply?" Chapman asked. His voice sounded strange in the cold, condensation-filled atmosphere. Mallinson checked the gauges with a flashlight. "We're at 48 hours remaining. Maybe less if we factor in the CO2 buildup." Both men were suffering from the cold now. Their core body temperatures had dropped dangerously low. They huddled together for warmth, but it was like trying to heat a refrigerator with a candle. The cold steel walls kept conducting the heat away from their bodies faster than they could generate it. Chapman's thoughts drifted to his family, his wife, his children. Would they understand what had happened? Would they know that he'd fought to survive, that he hadn't given up? "Don't," Mallinson said quietly, as if reading his mind. "Don't go there. We're getting out." On the surface, the rescue team was near despair. They'd tried everything, multiple diving attempts, different techniques with the COV-3, even considering sending down divers in pressure suits, though everyone knew that was a suicide mission at this depth. Then someone had an idea. What if they used Pisces II not just to observe, but to manually attach the lifting line? It would require incredible precision and skill, and it would put another submarine crew at risk, but it might be the only option left. The pilot of Pisces II, a veteran named Bob Eastaugh, didn't hesitate. "We'll do it." For the next several hours, in one of the most delicate operations ever attempted underwater, Pisces II maneuvered alongside the stricken Pisces III. Using its mechanical arm, Eastaugh worked to thread a toggle line through the lifting eye on top of Chapman and Mallinson's submarine. It was like trying to thread a needle while wearing boxing gloves, in the dark, with both hands tied behind your back. The first attempt failed. The second attempt failed. The third attempt failed. Inside Pisces 3, Chapman and Mallinson listened to the underwater communications. They could hear the frustration, the exhaustion in the voices of their would-be rescuers. They could feel every attempt, every failure, like physical blows. 60-hour mark, Mallinson whispered. They had 12 hours of air left. Maybe less. The cold was severe now. Both men were experiencing hypothermia symptoms, confusion, slurred speech, drowsiness. The drowsiness was particularly dangerous because if they fell into too deep a sleep, they might not wake up. Chapman forced himself to focus. "Tell me about your kids, Roger. Keep talking. We need to stay awake." Mallinson began talking, his voice weak but steady, describing his children, his home, his dreams for the future. Chapman listened and responded with his own stories. They talked to stay alive, using words as a weapon against the cold and the suffocating darkness. The 71st hour came and went. Then the 72nd. According to their calculations, Chapman and Mallinson should have already run out of breathable air. But they were still conscious, still breathing, barely. What they didn't know was that their calm, controlled breathing had stretched the oxygen supply beyond its rated capacity. By lying still, by speaking in whispers, by turning themselves into living statues, they'd managed to eke out a few extra hours from the scrubbers. But those extra hours were measured in minutes now, not days. On the surface, the crew of Pisces 2 was exhausted, having been underwater for hours themselves. But Eastor refused to give up. He made one more approach, one more careful adjustment with the mechanical arm. The toggle slipped through the lifting eye. "We've got it. The line is attached." The surface ship immediately began the slow, careful process of reeling in the line. Every foot had to be perfect. Too fast and the line might snap. Too slow and Chapman and Mallinson would die before they reached the surface. Inside Pisces 3, the two Rogers felt their submarine begin to rise. Chapman's watch showed they were at the 72-hour and 48-minute mark. They'd been underwater for 3 days and 48 minutes. They had 12 minutes of air remaining. "We're going up," Chapman said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't have the energy to say more. The ascent seemed to take forever. The darkness outside the porthole gradually shifted from black to dark blue to lighter blue. Chapman and Mallinson both found themselves taking shallow, desperate breaths, fighting for every molecule of oxygen in the increasingly carbon dioxide-saturated atmosphere. Mallinson's vision started to narrow. The edges went dark, tunneling down to a pinpoint. He could feel himself losing consciousness. Beside him, Chapman was barely responsive. The depth gauge showed 100 feet. Then 50 feet. Then 20 feet. Then, like being reborn, Pisces 3 broke through the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The hatch was thrown open immediately. Fresh air, blessed, sweet, life-giving fresh air, poured into the sphere. Hands reached down, pulling Chapman and Mallinson out into the sunlight. Both men were blue with cold, barely conscious, but alive. They'd been pulled from the ocean with an estimated 4 to 12 minutes of breathable air remaining. Roger Chapman and Roger Mallinson were rushed to medical facilities where they were treated for severe hypothermia and dehydration. Their core body temperatures were dangerously low, and both men had early stages of frostbite on their extremities. But they were alive. The rescue of Pisces 3 remained the deepest successful submarine rescue in history for decades. It had required the coordinated efforts of the British Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, the Canadian Navy, and dozens of civilian contractors and volunteers. Ships and aircraft from 3 countries had converged on a single point in the Atlantic Ocean to save 2 men trapped in a steel sphere at the bottom of the sea. When Chapman was asked later how they'd survived the psychological ordeal of being trapped for 3 days in freezing darkness, he said simply, "We never gave up hope. Not for a single moment. Mallinson added, and we had each other. When one of us felt despair creeping in, the other would pull him back. We kept each other alive as much as the oxygen did. Both men returned to work as submarine pilots after their recovery. Neither one let the traumatic experience drive them away from the ocean. Chapman later said that the sea had tried to claim them, but they'd refused to be claimed. They had stared into the abyss, and they had blinked last. The technical investigation revealed that a hatch seal in the rear compartment had failed, causing the flooding that sank Pisces 3. New safety protocols were immediately implemented across the entire submersible industry. The rescue also led to major advances in deep-sea rescue technology, with navies around the world developing specialized equipment and procedures based on lessons learned from the Pisces 3 incident. The two Rogers remained close friends for the rest of their lives, bound by an experience that no one else could truly understand. They'd spent 72 hours and 48 minutes in a refrigerated tomb at the bottom of the ocean, breathing recycled air, fighting cold and darkness and despair. And they'd survived. When asked if he ever thought about those 3 days, Chapman would smile slightly and say, "Every single day. But not with fear. With gratitude. We were given a second chance at life. Not everyone gets that." Roger Mallinson would nod and add, "And we learned something important. When everything is stripped away, warmth, light, hope, what remains is human connection. We kept each other alive with words, with presence, with refusal to let the other give up. That's what saved us. Not just the oxygen or the rescue. Each other." The story of Pisces 3 became legendary in the diving community, taught in submarine schools as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It proved that with determination, ingenuity, and international cooperation, the impossible could become possible. Two men could be pulled from the deepest depths of the ocean when everyone said it couldn't be done. The submersible itself, Pisces 3, was repaired and returned to service. It continued operating for many more years, a testament to both the engineering that built it and the resilience of the men who'd refused to die inside it. Chapman and Mallinson both lived long lives after their ordeal. They gave talks about their experience, always emphasizing the teamwork and dedication of the rescue crews who'd worked around the clock to save them. They never claimed to be heroes, just two men who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time and got incredibly lucky to have the right people looking for them. But to those who knew the full story, who understood the staggering odds against their survival, Roger Chapman and Roger Mallinson were exactly that, heroes. Heroes who faced their mortality with calm courage, who refused to panic even when every rational reason for panic existed, and who proved that the human spirit could endure even in the coldest, darkest, most isolated place on Earth. 72 hours and 48 minutes. 3 days at the bottom of the Atlantic. 12 minutes of air remaining when they surfaced. The deepest rescue in history. The longest odds. The closest call. And two men who lived to tell the tale. If you found this story incredible, imagine what other untold rescue missions are waiting to be discovered. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because next week, we're diving into the story of Apollo 13's CO2 crisis that almost suffocated 3 astronauts in space. You think being trapped underwater is terrifying? Wait until you hear about being trapped in a tin can 200,000 miles from Earth. Don't miss it.